Now we're recording. All right, so like I said, we're going to wait until the end for our questions. So make sure that you remember all the questions that you have, and I'm going to, at the end, move the chat box, and you can start entering all the questions that you may have. So welcome, everybody. We're going to be talking about behavioral strategies to address food refusal. And I hope that these strategies will help you expand your picky eater's diet. I want to make a point, though, that although picky eating is prevalent in children with autism spectrum disorders, the types of strategies that I will talk about today can be applied with any picky eater. So going over our agenda, we are going to talk about what picky eating looks like, what the behavior is, and you might be able to identify some of the common characteristics if you're having this issue with your child. We're going to talk a little bit about how behavior works and the functions of the behavior, and and I'm going to provide some of the behavioral strategies that I have used with some of my clients that have feeding issues. So how do we identify a picky eater? How does that look like? Well, it could be a child who refuses to eat, a child who takes too long to eat, or is very particular about the type of food that they eat. It could be the color, the texture. It's sort of like they have like a sensory issue. It could be a child that has difficulty swallowing, a child that chokes or gags when eating, a child that throws a tantrum whenever it's time to eat or whenever you provide a food. They start kicking, crying, biting, or a child who refuses to eat for days. There are several reasons why a child could be a picky eater. Things to think about, obviously medical reasons. We have to make sure that the food that you're providing or the ingredients that you use to cook your food is not causing any allergies or does not set well in their stomach. So that could be one of the reasons. Another reason could be a sensory one, like we mentioned. This is very typical in children with autism, as well as typical children. They just don't like the way that a food looks like, and they don't want to try it. Another reason could be they're stuck on a routine. The child is used to eating the same foods, chicken nuggets or pizza or arroz from Pollo Tropical or anything like that from a favorite restaurant. Or they're stuck on a specific food item, like the child only eats food that contains cheese or no sauce. So there's, what I'm referring to, because each child is different and they all have their particularities. It is important to change these habits, as we all need to consume, a specific amount of calories in the diet in order to have a healthy weight, as well as we need to consume the proper amount of food to receive the minerals and nutrients necessary for a healthy development. The other reason why it's important to change this habit is because for a functional reason, you're not going to be spending the rest of your life, providing special food for your child when they should be eating the same food as the rest of the family. And also, if they go to abuela's house or a friend's house or even a restaurant, you want to make sure that the child is able to order food from the menu or to eat whatever has been offered, wherever the child is at. So how do we change these habits? Here's a question. The first thing you should think and consider is rule out any medical condition. So take them to the doctor, make sure there's no physical evidence that the child's showing any allergies or any gastrointestinal issue. And once you rule that out, that's when you start considering implementing a behavior plan, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So before you begin to implement a behavioral plan, we need to become investigators. This is what we call an assessment of behavior. When we talk about assessing behavior, we talk about looking at the functions of the behavior. We ask ourselves, why is it that the child's not eating? Why is it that, what is it about the food? What are the consequences? What happens before I tell them that it's time to eat? So in behavior analysis, we talk about looking at the ABC, where A equals the antecedent, B means looking at the behavior, and C means the consequences. So you heard me talking about functions of behavior and how that is important in assessing behavior. Well, when we look at the ABCs, we're going to look in detail at the functions of this behavior. So antecedents refer to anything that happens before the behavior occurs. So is the child being removed from a fun activity or environment? You have to think about whether the child is motivated to eat. So is the child hungry? Did he have a snack before mealtime or before breakfast? So all of those things you have to think about when looking at the behavior. Next, we look at the behavior. We all, this is the easiest part. We all know what the child does whenever it's time to eat, whether they're choking or spitting the food or crying or screaming, anything that they do when it's time to eat. And then we have to look at the consequences. And consequences are very important in my opinion because this is what's going to determine what the function of the behavior is. And it refers to anything that happens after the behavior occurs. So do you pay attention to the child's behavior, like that picture is showing? Do you provide preferred food when the child starts throwing or refusing to eat? Do they escape from eating? And the term escape, you're going to hear me using it in this presentation, but it refers to when the child escapes from a situation or gets away from not doing the particular behavior that you desire. And in this case would be eating the food that you want him to eat or her to eat. So when assessing behavior and looking at the consequences, it is very important because it will determine whether the behavior will occur again or not in the future. So the factor that will determine this is whether the consequence is a reinforcement or a punishment. We like to focus on using consequences that are going to reinforce the behavior, specifically when we're talking about changing picky eating habits. So we refer to reinforcement as anything that happens or anything that you do after the behavior occurs that is going to increase the probability of that behavior in the future. And we refer to punishment as any event that follows the behavior or anything that you do that is going to decrease the probability of that behavior occurring in the future. So whatever you use, the consequences are going to determine whether the behavior occurs or not in the future. So in identifying the functions of the behavior, so once you start looking at the ABC of the behavior, you can start looking at the functions. So in identifying the functions, if they are attention seekers, then we say that the function of the behavior is attention. If they are escape seekers, then we say that the function of the behavior is escape. And if they are access seekers, we say that the function of the behavior is access to a preferred activity or toy or a preferred food. So now that while you're doing this assessment, it's important that you take data because it will provide you with a clear view of what happens before and after the behavior occurs. And it could help you determine what it is that we're doing wrong or what it is that's happening that you can fix, how you can manipulate the environment, how you can fix your consequences. So it's very important to take data because sometimes we don't look at these things until we start writing them down. So I provided here an example of how you can do that. You take a piece of paper and you make different columns, and you write the time of the day, A for antecedent, B for behavior, and C for consequences, and then you allow a column for function. And so let's say that for this particular example, the child wakes up in the morning, and the first thing the child does is go and in front of the computer and turns it on and starts playing video game. And at this point, you want the child to have breakfast, so you ask, the child to stop what they're doing and come and have breakfast. And the behavior is the child starts screaming, so you write that down. And then the consequence is that the child ends up not eating, and what I write there, then we write that the function of the behavior is escape because he was able to get out of the situation. Now let's say in the afternoon during lunchtime, he's still playing video games, and you ask him to come and have lunch, and he starts screaming again. But the consequence in this particular moment is that he's allowed to eat a preferred food, not the one that you want him to eat, after you fight with him and you say that he needs to eat the food. And he's allowed to eat not only the preferred food, but while he's playing the video game. So the function of that behavior, we say, is escape from having to go and sit at the table, and access to a preferred activity and access to preferred food. So taking data is very important in this process. So after you take the data for a few days and you figure out the ABCs and the function of the behavior, then you're ready to begin implementing your behavior change plan. So we're going to talk about all of these points and strategies that are necessary in order to change the behavior. But you don't have to follow them in any particular order. What we need to remember is that we need to use all of these strategies. So we're going to talk about using a reward system. So focusing on on reinforcing the behavior. So focusing on the consequences. We're going to talk about desensitizing. So for those that have a sensory issue on particular foods, we're going to talk about shaping that eating behavior. We're also going to talk about having a structured environment, which is extremely important, as well as having contingency rules. So I'm going to start with the reinforcers. And reinforcers refers to what is used to make a behavior occur again in the future. So I wanted to talk about it first as they're an integral part of the behavior change. Without a powerful reinforcer, behavior change is impossible. So this is very important for you to remember when looking at reinforcers and when selecting a reinforcer. So we're going to look at what is motivating for the child, and we're going to work with that. So what is a reinforcer? A reinforcer is any object, any activity, or any verbal statement that is going to increase that behavior when it follows the behavior. So how do you identify reinforcers? Sometimes it's very easy. You know what the child's favorite toy is, or what the child's favorite food is, or you know exactly what you need to do as far as like tickles or hugs. But sometimes you don't have it very clear. So I recommend doing a reinforcer assessment. And so what you do is you can either observe the child during free time and observe what they play with, what's their preferred toy, what they gravitate to the most. But if you're not sure, you can set out a few toys and then see what the child is playing with at that moment, what is catching their attention. And that's what you're going to go with at the moment. We all know that sometimes one week a child has a favorite toy and then the next week he has another toy that he wants to play with. So the trick is finding what's really a powerful reinforcer. So you continue analyzing the value of whether an item is reinforcing or not, and you're always going to work with the highest interest reinforcer. When we talk about types of reinforcers, I already made a point to those. We either talk about social reinforcers, which are primary reinforcers, like verbal praise, a hug, applause, saying hip hip hooray. And then we also talk about tangibles, you know, a preferred toy, a preferred book. iPads are very popular now because they provide an array of different apps that have games and are highly motivating for the child. I particularly use the iPad on feeding sessions, and it works very well. I basically, you know, after they take a bite of a new food, I provide the iPad for them to play for a few seconds, and then I remove the iPad and I continue with the session. And so they always know what they are working for. They always know that if they do something, they're going to get what they want. This is very important to keep in mind. So when you're rewarding the behavior, you're always going to think, now that we know the function of the behavior after we do the assessment, we're going to say, well, for those who are attention seekers, we're going to provide attention for appropriate behavior. So provide attention anytime they try a new food, or anytime they're playing appropriately, or anytime they're just sitting at the chair by the table, you know. So what's important to know here is that we're going to focus on whenever they're doing something good, catch them doing something good. Don't focus on the negative, focus on whenever they're doing something positive. For escape seekers, we're going to provide escape for appropriate behavior. So we're going to let them take a break from a demand. So after the child tries a bite of new food, we're going to say, okay, you can take a break and play and then come back and eat some more. Or you're going to provide taking a break after you're sitting appropriately at the table. And for access seekers, we're going to provide access for appropriate behavior. So we're going to provide access to preferred food after they try or eat a non-preferred food. We're going to provide access to a preferred activity after they try eating a non-preferred food. So those are all things to consider when you're thinking about the consequences. So I wanted to talk about schedules of reinforcement, because when teaching a new behavior, in this case introducing new food, you provide reinforcement right after the desired food is eaten. So we call this immediate reinforcer. So the child takes a bite and you give them a reinforcer. Then you remove the reinforcer and you provide the next bite. So it's always a give and take. So first this and then that. After the child is able to tolerate a particular food, reinforcement is faded out. Because what we want to is for the child to maintain that behavior. We don't want to have to be reinforcing the child constantly. Eventually, once they get used to, if it's a sensory issue, once they get used to the food, then, you know, we fade it out, and we basically just, after they eat the whole plate, then they can have their reinforcer. But also, once they are able to eat without a problem, that's when we move on to the next food item. So for children who have sensory issues with particular foods, we talk about desensitizing them. So when you think about introducing a new food, you're going to avoid foods that are too aversive. And we're going to start with food that are similar in texture and taste to the child's current diet. So let's say that the child likes to eat softer types of food, so you're going to start with softer texture, and then you little by little move on to harder and harder textures. So you begin with small amounts of particular food, and then you reinforce every time they try that new food. You have to go slowly. Now, sometimes some children can't even tolerate having a particular food inside their mouth and chewing. So what I've done in cases like this is we call this shaping the behavior. So we go little by little, and we reinforce closer approximations to the desired behavior. So in this case, what I've done is I have the child take a piece of, let's say that we're working with a piece of chicken nugget. We have the child touch the food to the tongue, for a specific amount of time. And once they start, we do this for several days or several times, and then until the child's able to tolerate and gets used to the taste. Then we move on to, and we reinforce, that particular behavior. Once they're able to tolerate more and more with more time, then we add, have the child try a small amount, and we have them put it in their mouth for a specific amount of time, and then chewing it. Then you can move on to perhaps chewing and swallowing. And so you increase the amount of food and the bite of food little by little. So structure environment is also a very key component in this, to implement in this behavior plan. We know from years of studying and working with children, and particularly with children in the spectrum, is that they are visual learners, and that structure is a key component to avoid anxiety issues related to transitions. Using a visual schedule provides that structure at home, and it facilitates the transitions. When it's time to eat, you can provide a verbal reminder, and you have the child check the schedule to reinforce the verbal cue and help the child stop what they're doing and move on to the next task. Sometimes they get so engrossed in whatever they're doing that when you tell them verbally it's time to eat, their immediate reaction is, no, I don't want to eat, because it could be that they just don't want to stop what they're doing. So, but if eating is an aversive thing, or it's not something they enjoy because of whatever reason, then it's going to be harder. So creating a schedule at home provides that structure. And also having a visual one, it helps as well. I mean, a lot of the children use these visual schedules at home, but we know that it works very well with children. Another reason why a structure and visual schedules are important is to reinforce eating time at the table. Now, this is very important, and it's something that I always tell parents. We have to make eating time at the table a part of the daily routine. A lot of people think that they end up using the reinforcers that are very powerful as a distractor. And what I mean by that is that sometimes parents feeding time is while the child is watching TV or while the child is playing a video game, and they think that by distracting them they can feed them, and that's not correct. What they're doing, it's really working backwards. So what you do is you create this contingency rule, and you say, we're going to talk about rules in a few minutes, but you say eating time is at the table, they check the schedule, they go to the table, and then you say eat a bite, and then you can go and play video games, or eat a bite and you can watch some TV. So creating a structured environment and making eating time at the table is very important. Now, sometimes you see children that cannot sit at the table. They just are very active, and they cannot sit on a chair for 1 minute. So if that is the issue, that's the first thing you work on. You cannot work on two behaviors at the same time. We cannot work on having that child sit at the table and eat a non-preferred food. We have to work on sitting at the table. And what I've done with that is I use timers. Timers really work good for duration behaviors. So the way that I explain people the use of timer is that if you're going to use a timer provides it's very clear what the beginning at the end and the end is. So what's expected of them. So you put the timer and you say you're going to sit here for 1 minute. So you put the timer, and they know that when the timer goes off that they can stand up. It just reduces that anxiety as well, and it's very clear for them. When creating a structured environment, you have to continue taking data. Again, sometimes we forget, but you continue taking data, and you say, well, you're going to write down the type of food that you're working with, the amount of food that you're giving the child, what you did to get the child to eat, This is important because you don't want to move too fast. So you want to stay and work with one particular food until you are sure that the child is eating that food. You don't want to work on eating rice one day and then eating beans the next day. You want to make sure that you continue working with rice until you're definitely have that behavior maintained, and he's able to tolerate that food. Also, no distractions. Dinner time should be at a table. We already talked about this. And no TV or computer use while feeding. So use your reinforcers, which in this term could be watching TV or playing a video game, to as a contingency after they eat the non-preferred food. Visuals are not only good, as I mentioned before, for structure and for creating a schedule at home, but it also is good to establishing contingency rules. Children don't always process auditory commands appropriately, so using visuals can help with that. And I provided here an example of a first-then board, and I like it because it is a very systematic way of providing contingencies. It's basically, I put an example there. First, you eat the pasta, and then you can have a little piece of cracker. Make sure that you don't provide a whole cracker, because then they fill up very quickly, and you just want to make sure that they have to work for it and continue working for their reward. This is something that we are familiar with. We call it grandma's rule in behavior analysis, but what it is, when you were little and you didn't want to eat your vegetables, your mom would tell you, eat your Brussels sprouts and then you can have dessert. Or it doesn't necessarily apply to eating. It could be do your homework first and then you can play outside. So it's just a very systematic way and visual way of showing the child what's expected of them. Another thing that I like using, it's like this behavior chart. It's like a token board where you accumulate tokens until you get your reward. But in this case, you cross out bites until you can get the reward. I used this specifically with a case where a child was learning to eat chicken nuggets, and it worked very well because obviously I had faded out the reinforcer. I wasn't providing reinforcer after every bite, but in this case I was providing a reinforcer after 6 bites. So what worked very well was that every time the child took a bite, he would cross out a square, and that way he knew exactly how many more bites he had left before he would get his reinforcer. It worked very well. So that's another thing you can use at home. So I have presented some strategies to use when introducing new foods and changing eating habits, but I wanted to talk about extinction. Extinction is when you withhold a reinforcer when a problem behavior occurs. It is important to talk about extinction because sometimes we make the mistake and reinforce inappropriate behavior. Remember when I told you that we're going to reinforce appropriate behavior? If they're attention seekers, we provide attention. If they're access seeker, we're going to provide access anytime they're doing something correctly. But with extinction, we try to ignore the negative behaviors. And what you do is you basically present the contingency rule, remain as neutral as possible. So don't provide attention when the child starts screaming or spitting the food. Don't provide access to preferred toys or activities or even prefer food if they don't try new food. And don't provide escape from a demand before at least having them try the food. Now, some behaviors could be a little dangerous, and we just want to make sure that if they occur, they're difficult to ignore, and it's important for you to redirect the behavior as neutral as possible without providing too much attention to it. So yes, you block, and yes, you redirect the behavior, the inappropriate one, but you continue firm on your contingency rules. Understanding extinction and how it works is important to avoid reacting to extinction burst. And extinction burst is basically when a behavior is under control and it's ignored, but then all of a sudden it could increase and show up at any moment. And so the key thing is to not react to it and to not let you be caught off guard. So when this is very normal, and it's important to stay the course and follow through. Now remember, behavior is strengthened or weakened by its consequences. Behavior ultimately responds better to reinforcement, and always remember and keep in mind the function of the behavior. Some tips to facilitate success is definitely be patient, stay calm, use very powerful reinforcers, and don't forget about your rules. Set up those contingency rules right at the beginning and don't veer from them. Stay focused on them, and you'll see how they'll get the hang of it and they'll react well to it, especially if you're using visuals. And then don't force a feeding. Don't get caught up in getting desperate because your child's not eating and then forcing food into their mouth, because all that creates, it's what you're doing is reinforcing that negative behavior because you're providing attention to the fact that he's not eating. So don't force a feeding, and make feeding time something fun by using those reinforcers. You don't want feeding time to become a negative experience. Here's the information on how to contact us, and please know again that this and all previous card vines are recorded and you can access them through our website. And I'm going to stop the recording and allow some of the questions. So let me stop recording.